All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Codementor Office Hours. Today, we're very excited to have Dean Sofer here today. Dean is the founder of AngularUI and a frequent conference speakers. So today, we have an open office hours regarding AngularJS. So Dean, let's get started.
Hi, guys. I guess I'll give a brief intro. As you probably know, for the past 20 minutes, my name is Dean Sofer. Been working with Angular since 0.9, like a few years ago, before it was really popular. I used to do blogs and tutorials and built a cute couple of libraries. And when it got really popular, everybody started building tools, and there were about 400 date picker Angular directives, and I said, let's combine them all, make life easier for everybody. So we founded the organization AngularUI, and now I kind of ride on the coattails of Angular's success. And so it seems like we've got a bunch of questions that people want to know answers to today, so I guess I'll just jump on that. All right, should I just get started with the question that was asked right before we started recording?
Sure.
Sorry, if the person who asked it, you mind unmuting yourself and asking us one more time?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I was asking about kind of what are your favorite things about Angular UI, and then what are the best kind of practices or design patterns that is good to be used with, when we use Angular UI or UI router, or in other resources you recommend?
So Angular UI is kind of like, it's gone in many different directions. It used to be one suite, and then it just got so big that we broke it into multiple projects, and it became an organization. And some of my favorite projects are UI router, hands down. It's like the most valuable part of Angular there is. And I used to be a lot more into UI Bootstrap because I started really getting into the Bootstrap suite. But that's an ambiguous situation because the main issue is maintenance and having people spend their free time working on these projects, and Bootstrap has been falling a little bit behind. And Angular Strap, which is a competitive Bootstrap suite for Angular, was doing a bunch of things in the wrong way, and then he kind of trashed everything and started over, and we were kind of him versus us for a long time. But lately I've been a little less impressed with some of how directives have been implemented in UI Bootstrap. So I don't actually recommend anything. I tend to recommend using your simple HTML logic and CSS classes and custom building. But UI router is awesome, but check out all the projects. I mean, I used to be really adamant about the utility suite, Angular UI utility suite, which provides things like much richer validation. You can add multiple custom validation rules by simply declaring a function on the scope. You could use promises in your validation. You could do there was a couple of other tricks we had, like you can quickly slap a jQuery plugin onto the page in about a couple of seconds. But we tried to build it as like a basic building block that other people could stack together into other tools. And then, I don't know, check out the modules, check out the projects. As for, you're talking about organizational practices, and feel free to interrupt me because I have this really bad habit of rambling. Organization is like changing. I think people are still figuring it out. And I don't know if you guys have checked out the YouTube video that's posted on my profile. If you Google AngularJsORM, I should maybe even share the screen. Let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. So AngularJsORM was a talk I snuck into, what is it called? I snuck it into the Angular conference. You guys can see my screen, right?
I cannot see it.
I can't.
Yeah, we still see the
Oh
speaker.
boy,
Yeah.
Zoom just like disappeared. Can you guys hear me still?
Yep.
You have
You
to
can
click
see
on
me?
the green share screen button.
I did. It just disappeared. All right, never mind. If you guys can see me, that's fine. So check out AngularJsORM, Object Relational Model. And it's a project structure that I developed based off of the UI boot. Some of the people who worked in AngularUI, Pavel and Pete and Andy Jocelyn and a few other guys were like pushing. And it's a much more modular structure. People do service folders and directive folders and filter folders, and they break things down by their function, but they don't try to break down their application in a modular way. And I think that's the wrong direction. After the last company I worked at, what I really think is the new direction for people to go in is to break it down your project in a modular way. So I don't even use a CSS folder anymore or a JavaScript folder anymore or an HTML folder. I now have, and I tried creating this demo project on GitHub/ProLoser/AngularJsORM, and I have a modules folder, and this contains your CSS and your JavaScript and your HTML. And it's this nested module hierarchy, so I can have projects plural, and under that project singular or project edit, or if there's a task that belongs to a project, I can have a tasks folder that falls underneath the project. And these modules contain the HTML templates, they contain the JavaScript, they contain the CSS, and I can just rip out an entire folder, and that in all the different assets that go along with that module will be taken out. But in addition to that, I have my controllers specific for a project written into the project.js, and the routes specific to the project written into that JS, and the services and the classes and factories and directives. And if you do really elegant code, you'll find that your JavaScript is so tiny. In my project, I don't have a whole lot I kind of put all these JavaScript utilities together into one file, and I would expect you to use logic to break them apart and spread them out a bit more rationally. But the main thing is, don't be obsessed with this focus that you need a service file and a controller file and a module file and a directive file. Don't be married to that. That's not the important breakdown. That's completely superfluous. The important breakdown is you have a project section, and you have a task section, and you have a user section, and that those rationally reflect your objects of the system. So that's why I call it a relational model, and how you structure your application, that's how I break things down. Does that answer your questions? Anybody want me to iterate on that or anything?
I kind of feel like when I go that direction, I tend to seem like I'm going to have just hundreds of modules.
No,
and I don't know
guess
why,
not.
but I have this.
All right. Do we have another question? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Somebody else is trying to ask you a question, though. I don't know if you can hear them.
I cannot. I can't even see the Zoom window.
Sol was just posting another question. Yeah.
Give me 1 second. Let me restart Zoom.
Okay.
Can other people hear me?
I can hear you. Who is speaking?
Okay. Justin.
Justin. Okay. Dean, can you hear Justin?
He's dropped off for a second.
I'm not sure Dean's still there.
Okay.
Let's wait for Dean a little bit.
Sorry about that. You guys can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the screen sharing things pretty much broke Zoom for me. All right, I'm back. What was the question I missed? Or did somebody ask it?
I've started leaning towards or trying to go down the route of a lot of modules, but it just seems like I start to have so many different modules quickly because of the size of some of the applications, and it also feels like there's so many places that the overlap happens that I just end up with some massive project.shared module.
Yeah, I've been That's the other thing. I have been a little bit lucky, and my projects have gotten large, but they haven't been like Google corporation conglomerate large. And I've been rethinking my attempts to nest the folders. And I get that you need to reuse things in different places. Off of that, like, I don't have a good suggestion. I know this sounds kind of lame. One of the things I tried to do was trying to reappraise your shared module and see if that can be broken up. Do you have any examples of more specific things? Like, I know that authentication, so in my last project, we had like a sockets and authentication and then global declarations and users are tied to authentication, and authentication is tied to the sockets, and sockets are tied to global declarations. But the main thing was, if we kept our code efficient, things would stay small, but I realize it's kind of an irrational request to make. But we started sectioning off. We have an authentication module, we have a user module, and we found that we delegated, like, for instance, something as simple as global declarations into each module. And so, like, instead of having all of your external module dependencies declared at your root app level, the user module in its module declaration would declare what services or utilities or plugins it would need, and instead of putting them at a top level. But I think it's hard to give you a suggestion to the question, I have a big project, what do I do? I don't know. I'd have to look at it.
I understand that. And it probably also stems from client and change.
Yeah.
It's really hard to separate that out. If anybody else doesn't have any secondary questions, you just kind of have a question about UI router.
Sure.
I haven't messed with Ember, but from what I understand, they typically, in their router, they typically base everything on the URL and work outward from there. The URLs state. And I was kind of curious about how you feel like that is in comparison to UI router. UI router definitely has components for the URL, but it's certainly not as focused on it as Ember. Like, do you have any experience with the Ember router in comparison to UI router?
No. I personally have not worked with Ember at all. I've done some cursory exploration of Ember when I was comparing Ember versus Angular. I know that the UI router takes a ridiculous amount of inspiration from Ember. And I personally believe, like, I've heard some people say the Ember router does a little bit more than Angular, and some of that was like the auto magic. Like, if you define a route named user, it would automatically look for a file named user, an HTML file named user. But that's sort of something you could easily sprinkle onto UI router itself. But UI router is a state machine. It's at the very basic level, it's a state machine. And you'd have to look up state machine. And I didn't even know what it was when they started working on it. I was kind of lost on it. But once I started leveraging this concept of states, routing is like, the URL is just decoration on top of a state machine. A state machine is your basic building blocks of the structure of your application. The URL is like, aliasing and pretty access and shortcuts. But the state machine, I think, is a lot more resilient and stronger and versatile in the long run when you build your application in that sort of manner. I said create a module that's like a projects module, and then a singular project module that falls under it, and then a tasks plural module that falls under project singular, and then a task singular module and a task.edit module. All of those things could be mapped out to the UI router state machine. So you could have a projects plural and projects.view, and then projects.view.tasks and projects.view.tasks.view and things like that. And when you think about it in states, you can map any of these to whatever URL you want. But yeah, the URL is completely unnecessary to UI router. You could build an entire application without having any URLs And all you would really lose is the ability to refresh your page and pick up what state you were left off on, but you could still move around the system. And to me, that's like, it's nice that I'm able to have that distinction, that like, I'm not married to the URLs. I can break down my app even more deeply than simply changing the URL. And there's no reason why I can't also have the URL reflect that, but I'm not limited by it. Does that make sense? Or
I think so.
was there like, did you feel, it sounded like you had some disappointment, or you felt it was better to be more?
No, I think the way that like the most prevalent question I would ask myself when thinking about states are, do I want the back button to go here? So I think I might have been coming at it from the wrong.
That is yeah, I think, I'm sorry, but I think that might be the worst thing to think about when you're breaking down your application. Like, I'm not saying it's not a relevant concern, but it's not relevant when I'm breaking down my app. I might break down my app locally based on structure, which is what ORM's all about. It's about modularizing and breaking down the app. And then later come back and be like, really what you want is a feature that manages the URL history, but doesn't dictate project structure. You just literally want to be like, when I hit the back button, where do I want it to take me to? And that's something, I don't have an answer right off the top of my head, but I would tackle it separately from the project structure. I actually don't even focus on the back button. I mostly decide, do I want this state accessible via URL, or do I want it to be like, when I refresh the page, where am I landing? And I just kind of, it seems, and make sure transitioning in and out is done properly, and make sure assets that are needed. Like, if I refresh the page, will I have all the data on the screen? Or if I clicked on state 1 and then go to state 2, did the data I need from state 1 not get loaded in if I refreshed and jumped straight to state 2? If that sort of reasoning is sorted out and it's all done by resolves, then I don't know, like, worrying about the back button, the forward button hasn't been a problem for me. That's been my experience. Back button is like one button on the entire web page, whereas I'm more focused on the entire web page.
Right, and I guess more so than the back button, I was thinking as states as URL addressable things. But same concept.
Yeah, and I get that, but the states are so much more than that, and it's so much nicer not being tied to that.
I'll definitely shift my thinking going forward and try to explore that.
Build your entire application without URLs at all. Like, just when you build an initial prototype or something, just drop the concerns of URLs, and then come back in and treat the URL as like a convenience, like what do they call it? Vanity URL. Every single state could have a vanity URL, but it doesn't need to. And the only time URLs are even important is when you need parameters from them. And like, I always build out my states first and come back and tweak the URLs later. And remember, you can always alias URLs, so don't build stupid URLs. Just don't build a stupid module structure just to get a URL you want. Anyways, any other questions?
I'll ask a question. We do a lot of back-end Ruby and Rails work, and we have RSpec tests for everything. I look at your ORM GitHub site and some of the other things I've heard you say about organization. How do you build in tests to how you're organizing?
I will be honest with you, tests have not been my forte. I'm not to say I haven't worked with tests. And one of the things about this ORM project that I might change now is I might not nest it all. Is there something like specific? Because I know all the code I had there is testable, because I've written tests around code like this before. Yeah. Was there something specific that stood out to you?
If I look at our code, we end up with a lot of code in the controllers.
Uh-huh.
And so it's very hard to test a piece of code when you've got a 500-line controller.
Yeah, and
controllers,
everybody agrees, tiny controllers.
Right. So where would you organize things out from the controller? Where would you organize it out to?
So the project makes a huge emphasis on what I call classes, or CoffeeScript classes, but you don't have to use classes. They're just factories. So if you go to my project module and open project.coffee, and keep in mind these coffee files, which are essentially JavaScript files, should probably be broken apart. So I don't actually expect people to keep everything in one file. It's just, I was trying to keep things small and all in one place. But in my project.coffee, I've got around line 59 a project object, and this whole project has objects, and they're CoffeeScript classes, and those are just, these classes end up being simple prototypes, and that is where I tell people put 90% of your logic into these factories, these classes if you can, and put 9% of your logic into your state machine, and then you'll find that your controllers are just 1% of logic, and it's literally taking stuff and putting it on the scope, and taking stuff and taking it off the scope, and that's it. Most of my logic in here is in the classes, and the classes they're agnostic to Angular. They're literally just JavaScript prototypes, and most of the data manipulation, there is no mention of scope anywhere in these classes. There's no mention of services or factories other than simple HTTP requests. It's all just
exposing interfaces.
Yeah. And these, I used Coffee. I mentioned in the project, don't use Coffee just because I use Coffee. I use Coffee because I wanted a simple syntax to create classical inheritance. And I use classical inheritance to impose, as you said, an interface in my project. But that's the main place where you want to keep your test-worthy code.
Cool. You want to come by and help us refactor it out someday?
Sure. You guys are in San Francisco, right?
Santa Barbara, even better.
Yeah, Santa Barbara.
Sure, why not?
We keep you busy.
Dean, I got a question that is very general and will be very brief, I'm sure. I see a lot of companies that I've been interviewing with lately, they're all using Angular. Whereas I recently learned coding through General Academy, and they taught us about Backbone. And I know Ember is out there as well. I'm wondering, where do you see the future of these, Angular versus Backbone versus any other competitor?
You're going to want to jump on Angular because that one's taking off.
Yeah.
Ember was a solid project. The Backbone was just so popular, and it had such a foothold that Ember, I think, wasn't able to supersede it. But Angular took a lot of what Ember does, and it made it even easier, and even turned it into PHP, where any dumbass can write horrible code in it. And it's just kind of like people can't even argue with the simplicity of use. Of course I'm going to be biased. I personally think Angular is the way to go, unless the roadmap, unless problems arise with the community or the project or development. But, and it's gotten Angular started off easier to use, and then it got a little more complicated. So that might happen. But right now, Angular is definitely a hot ticket. And one thing I think is relevant is a question of Angular versus Backbone. Backbone is a widget builder. It just builds little blocks of HTML with JavaScript tied to them. That's it. And it's all about its render functions in Backbone. And Angular is a live templating engine. And Ember is also a live templating engine. And Knockout's also a live templating engine. But the whole live templating engine where just simply putting bindings onto DOM elements and having data come back to you in a really easily accessible manner, that's like the direction we want to go in. And once you get around, it took like 2 weeks for me and my coworkers to get around the mindset of ng click, because you're brought up with never doing on mouse click and on mouse hover. But once you let go of that and start doing it everywhere, you realize this declarative binding approach is awesome, because you can just move click bindings all over the place and your JavaScript is perfectly untouched. And Backbone, you've still got all this jQuery DOM. You have a lot of HTML knowledge in your JavaScript, and your JavaScript shouldn't be changing that much. Your HTML should be changing all the time, and your CSS changes a lot.
When you're talking about ng-click, I know we're not supposed to use it, but you're saying get past that. I have a question. Like, I read that Angular is very friendly towards IE, whereas a lot of times when you're trying to do JavaScript on-click, certain Internet Explorers don't exactly work well with it. What does Angular do to actually make it, more compatible with the Internet Explorer? And I guess backwards compatible is probably better, but
so there's nothing wrong with using ng-click. I'm saying in the past, people used to preach against using on mouse click and on mouse hover, the native browser bindings.
Mhm.
I honestly don't know anything specific about Internet Explorer around that click binding you're talking about, but Angular abstracts these declarative bindings on mouse click and on mouse hover to I could go into why Angular does it. It's better to use an Angular binding versus a native HTML binding. Something as simple as you know what, I'm not going to get into it. Angular does it better. They all do it better. They all don't use the native one. Just use them. That's one thing. Just pretend it's magic and it works beautifully. I'm sorry. Because when you talk about IE compatibility, the bindings are not where the issue is at. If you want to start digging into Internet Explorer compatibility, which I don't honestly think anybody wants to right now, there's other far more bigger backwards compatibility problems. And personally, I don't deal with backwards compatibility. If somebody's going to be working on a platform that's super old, I'm probably not building a product for them. Sorry. I choose to pass on that one.
All right, thank you.
Anyone else? So many people, you guys don't have any questions.
I have one.
Okay.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So suppose you have a site running on Backbone or CanJS, and you're planning to migrate to Angular. What would you recommend? Can you interact with another framework there, or give the jump to Angular on one hop shot, or I don't know?
Oh God, a migration question. I don't think I have a good answer, unfortunately. I think other people here who've done framework transitions can attest to the fact that other than brute force and losing 50% of your hair, as you can see, I've lost most of it, there isn't a magic trick to it. There's nothing I can tell you that makes it more convenient other than maybe finding somebody who's familiar with both, or finding someone who knows the new framework really well to reduce your learning curve as much as possible. But I don't know of anything off the top of my head that would make the transition easier. I'm poking around CanJS. Backbone just goes about things differently. And I tend to just build things from scratch. Like, you're going to have a bigger nightmare trying to port over old logic and wrapping it. Like if you modularize CanJS or Backbone logic inside of Angular, I can only imagine nightmares. So other than brute force, elbow grease, and time, I don't have a good solution for you.
All right, thanks.
I'm sorry. I know that's not the answer you wanted. Get on the community. Talk to other programmers and learn Angular as quickly as you can. So if you look at the old code, you just know how to do this in Angular, and you know how to do it in half the amount of lines of code. And it becomes a lot less daunting task that way. Any other questions?
You guys hear me?
Yes.
Alright, I had a question about Angular for doing local storage. So like if I go to a detailed page about something and I hit back, I don't want to reload from like a server. Does Angular have a good way to do that where like I don't do caching, or do I have to handle that with some other service?
That's outside the scope of concern for Angular. That's not to say you can't, there isn't good solutions for that in Angular, but the answer is there are plugins for that. Like go look up, so if you, specifically to your question, I have a library I like to use. Let's see if I can find it. Storage local, where is it? It's like an ng local storage or something like that. It's on GitHub.
Angular
And
local storage?
I think so. I think it's like ng local storage. And the main thing is instead of using getters and setters, they have a dollar local storage service that you inject, and you do dollar local storage dot name equals Ben and dot age equals 23. And it does getting and setting. So it watches this service object and it will call the getters and setters for you. And I think it handles large objects. It will serialize them, or some, you may have to do that yourself. But I love the approach of not using getters and setters because that's a very Angular-esque mentality. And so there are a few Angular local storage wrappers, but I personally recommend that one. I'll try and find it, but somebody else. Angular local storage. Someone else might have to ask a question in the meantime. Any other questions?
Yeah, we run into issues where when we change some binding downstream, it affects bindings upstream, and we get caught, especially when those dependencies are all asynchronous. It's really maybe start looking at the one-way data flow for React. Have you run into similar situations where that would help, or how you solve that with Angular's two-way data bindings?
Sorry, you're going to have to go over the first half. You said asynchronous data bindings?
So like one instance is, so we had like three cascading drop downs, and we tried to initialize it, and whenever the binding for the first one was set, when it was getting it, the other two didn't have data, so it would reset those bound properties to null before the get that populated the first drop down. I'm probably doing a terrible example of explaining
So
this.
yeah, you sound exactly like my nightmare that was. Are you familiar with UI Select 2? Or
UI Select 2 through so many problems because of the way NG options doesn't work.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. I'm just going to say this now. To anybody who's used UI Select 2, I apologize. I wrote it. It was a mess. I said it was a mess the whole time. People kept asking for more convoluted features. The guy who built Select 2, I actually had to go in and help him. So there's huge pull requests that I did, and large chunks of his code base I personally added just to help the development of UI Select 2. And the whole project has got way more features than necessary, and it makes the whole thing convoluted. You may have heard of UI Select, which is another project where we tried to just scrap the approach to using a third-party library and just do it from scratch. But anyways, to answer your question, asynchronous bindings, I can't speak about React, but I can say that there is a, as I feel, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. To me personally, that's resolves. A lot of times in my application, I've had to deal with async logic, where the page loads and you have a lot of null value, and then you're doing a bunch of AJAX requests to load in your initialization data. But if you're doing multiple ones at the same time, promises can help you chain things together and go from 20 asynchronous requests to one asynchronous request. But you still have to have initialize a page with nulls and then initialize the page with the actual data a second later. Resolves turns most of your controller logic into it turns most of it non-async, and it's a godsend. If you can put as much stuff as possible into your resolves, you'll be thanking yourselves later. One thing, a simple, stupid, possibly convoluted approach would be creating nested states, for instance, where say you have 3 dropdowns, having the one dropdown is like state 1, and then having the second dropdown populated is a substate, and having the third dropdown populated is the third state. I don't have a good answer to your issue of, you talked about initializing values.
Now that I think about it, I probably could use a resolve because it's not until the entire promise is resolved. So because I have all three initial values, I think I might be able to work it into initial resolve. I didn't think of doing that. My original thought was that I needed to create a directive that did not allow the binding to start watching until the select list had items to be bound to.
I mean, you're talking about stuff that I was dealing with when I was building UI Select. I kind of have to look at the code, but let me ask you this simple question. Are these 3 choices, do they choose one and then the other second and then the third? Like, is it the same order? And does the choice of number 1 affect the list of options for number 2? Or is it just 3?
No, it's what you said. It does cascade downward, and the from blank scenario wasn't bad. It was trying to prime things that were already set in all 3 instances that gave me some problems.
Just separate your data, your defaults from your selected, and make sure you don't have reference issues. Just make sure you have your defaults and somewhere else that's preserved and pristine and intact, and when you load in the results, that's kind of what I had to do with UI Select. I had to keep checking my defaults every single time, because in UI Select 2, there were like 4 different asynchronous events. There was the jQuery plugin loaded, and then the data from the server loaded. Like, what if not only the list of options came from the server, but the list of the option that the guy has previously selected came from the server? So say I got person number 1, but all I have is like an ID number. And then the rest of the guy, like the first name, the last name, I'm supposed to look up in a list, and that list comes from the server too. So I might get the ID number first, but not know the rest of the details about that ID. Or I might get the list of people first, but I might not know which one was already selected. And that sort of juggling made me tear my hair out. But I don't know. UI Select 2 is not going to be the answer. Resolves are going to help you out. And keep your defaults stored somewhere safe, in a safe variable that's pristine, and just keep checking it. I don't have a better solution. Separate out your, like, when you get the data for what things were already selected, make a copy of that. That's really what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sorry. Anybody else?
Any plans for the happy path of UI Select, the unbloated, simple searching functionality?
Have you already checked out the project?
Which one?
UI Select.
Oh, no. I've only looked at UI Select 2. So you say UI Select, is that active?
It exists. It is more active than Select 2.
Okay, then I'll look there.
Then go check it out. I can't say it does everything Select 2 does, but I can say that there are other people working on it. I personally am not active anymore on almost any of the projects, but I told a lot of the people who ask about a Select 2, if they really bother me or they're really saying, like, there's got to be a better way to do this, I say, go check out Select 2. It's so much lighter that it's not insane an idea for you to add the features you want to it, just because it's written so much more lightly than Select 2 was. Whereas Select 2, you're dealing with this massive jQuery plugin.
Right. Could you I'm guessing it's going to be UI Select. I just don't know if Google's going to dominate it, but it's UI Select 2.
It's Angular GitHub / AngularUI / UI Select. If you
okay.
It's under the AngularUI, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, great.
And there's a link. And whoever asked about the local storage, if you haven't already, I posted a link to the library I personally recommend in the group chat. and JSKLEE/ng storage on GitHub. Anyone else? Any other questions?
I have a question if you can hear me.
Yep.
Kind of to the loading thing that you guys were talking about before. If I get these scenarios where basically I have circular references, and I didn't even realize that it was a problem until the compiler basically said, "Sorry, you can't have A pointing to B." What I wanted to do was have a user object, and then have that user object get loaded with a bunch of data from different services over time. So first I load the application. The first thing I do is I load the user object, and it loads just very basic data. Then it loads some portfolio data, and later on it might load some other objects. But all those objects, they need access to the user object. But so they can't point, they end up wanting to point at each other, and it says, fuck off, basically. Now, should I create like a global data object that user takes, and then everybody works off that?
So I had this almost same exact issue when I was building the project that AngularORM was inspired by. And I talked to my CTO, and that's like a general programming concept. And I find it's helpful to talk it out to people who know lots of different design patterns. And the response I got from him was, if you have circular dependencies, you're doing something wrong, and there's lots of ways to clean things up to fix these circular dependencies. So I've seen lots of different ways. That being said, so one issue I had was we have a socket system. We had a user class, and we had an authentication class. And when you open up a socket, I had to authenticate you. And what do I use to authenticate? A user object. And so it created this weird triangle. And deciding what fell under where was kind of arbitrary. Like, there was no real reason why I chose that this guy had access to this or that guy had access to that. But it's just, I kept playing with it over time, and things started to settle down. But to specifically answer your question of how do I get past circular dependency, there's lots of different patterns. I'm hoping somebody with a CS degree can chime in if they know the name of these patterns, because that way you can get more information. But you can create, let's say I have, so one thing we needed was my authentication class could not have a user inside of it, but the user could have the authentication class. Let's just say that's true. But the authentication class needed a validation function, which was all about validating a user, and I put that inside the user class. So auth is inside of user, but he needs something from user, which is surrounding auth. So what I did was I spun up an instance of auth inside of user. I used a singleton, like a factory. And then what I did was I passed in a piece of information about the user in. So I have like, in my authentication, I have validate user is a function, but it's an undefined function. It's a no-op. And what I was hoping what I would do is I inject auth into user, and then user calls auth.setValidator, and I pass in a reference to the validation function. And so I'm kind of monkey patching the authentication to have a body of logic that's actually residing inside the user. And that body of logic has access to all the information inside the user class, but I can still call it from within auth. So essentially spin up an object and add in a function onto the object after it's been constructed. That's one way of doing it. And you can do it, it's like one guy falls inside the other. I sometimes do it in the constructor. So when I use the classical CoffeeScript stuff, constructors and things like that, I might pass in at construction time, or I might just create a method simply called set utility function or some crap like that. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pattern that I can experiment with.
Yeah. Does anybody know what I'm talking about, the name of these patterns? It's fine. But yeah, try monkey patching it. Okay. And to make it to make it more API-esque, or to create a better, what is it called? To make it a better contract, create methods specifically called set this utility function. And then there's also a function called call utility function or something like that.
And one more question. This is very specific. When I'm doing a resolve, how do I inject if I wanted to just return back the promise? So I have a factory which has certain initialization states. So example, the user will resolve a promise after it's actually loaded, so that anybody who is dependent upon it can look at that promise. So now I'm in UI router, and I want to only load this page after the user has gotten all the user data. The way I currently do that now is I do like r:, and function, and then I inject into that function, and then I access the promise from there because I've injected it. What I'd kind of like to do is just do r:, and then the promise, but I can't. When I try to inject the factory into the top of the state, the top of the UI router, I get an error opposed to injecting it into the actual resolve function. Is that just something you can't do?
I may be a little confused when I'm trying to follow you. If you're using resolves, your resolves must be functions because they will be executed. And you said you're having problems returning the promise in the resolve function?
I just put one row into the chat window. So this is what I do that works. But what I've done before is, instead of doing r:, function, I've actually just passed it a promise right there. Like I've done this also, where I've tried to do this at least. So
so you said that's giving you problems?
Yeah, this is a promise, like what this s.gj blah, blah, that big long string, that is a promise, right?
My guess is ghc.drill.state.waitForLoadListManager doesn't exist when this line of code is being executed. Because you got to remember, this line right here is going to be executed during the config phase, not during this route is being loaded phase. Like, does that make sense? Like, the value of S is being set like right when this whole thing is parsed, whereas the value of R is set to a function, and then we can call that function way later when the route is actually being spun up, versus when on the second version, you've got the value is set to whatever that it has when we're storing the routes.
Okay.
Right? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense. I just was looking for like a way of making these really bullet point and elegant, where you just have one row, one resolve, and then the promise. Because basically now I just have these empty functions that just return back promises.
Well, you could just do like you could have the function return that same exact value. You could just return that. It doesn't have to return a promise.
Okay. Cool.
Like I've had a resolve, which is a function, and it just returns true, or it returns null, because I had static data. I didn't want asynchronously loaded data, or the data was already available for whatever convoluted reason. There's no reason, but wrap it in a function. You have to wrap it in a function. That's it.
Yep.
I think the pattern might be decorator. I was talking about adding something into like the auth. I think decorator might be a good thing to go check out, because what you've got is one utility decorating another utility with extra capability. So
Okay, I'll read about that.
there another solution. I know I'm kind of backtracking. Another way we bypass this circular dependency, and I think you mentioned it, we did also attempt to create like a state manager. It was like this global service that could inject all the guys and move information around all of them. And that works too, but we tried that first and it got really convoluted and it got really stupid and we got rid of it. And I ended up going with the decorator approach because it was the amount of logic that I needed inside of one from the other was really light. So
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was worried about going with that way. I was worried that basically I'm just going to make it into spaghetti code and have a, if I try to have this one global thing.
Yeah. The one weirdness to it is like, say we need, in order for auth to get a validate user function, you need to make sure user got spun up. It had to be spun up even if nobody used the user class, just so that user would spin up, it would bring in auth, and it would decorate it. So what I have in like the runtime, the module.run of my user module is to just spin up the user class. I don't actually do anything with it. I literally just inject it so I know it got constructed at least once. Or if I needed auth throughout the entire application, at the app root level in my .run, I injected user just so I knew that when my application opens up, the user class got spun up, which that means that the authentication class has been properly decorated. But it was one line of code, and it seemed useless, but I wrote a little comment saying why I put it in here, and I moved on with life. Also, under that theory, you could have actually transferred, like I could have in my app.run, injected user and auth, and then done auth.set validation to user.validator. And like the .run is kind of like this global area where you could mess with everything. Anyways, moving on. Any other questions? I think we're running out of time.
Hey, Dean, I had one question, if you don't mind me asking. And it's I don't intend to sound like a troll or anything, but in your personal opinion, for someone looking just to create a basic web app, a single page web app, how would you rate Angular in comparison to EmberJS? That's always a question I've asked myself, and I've never really had gotten to a definite conclusion as to which is best, I guess what use case is best for each one.
So again, I haven't used Ember,
Okay.
so I'm going to be biased.
Okay.
I have done some code samples. It's funny because like a week ago, I was reading an article about this guy trying to unbiasedly compare the two. And I felt, I'm pretty sure his arguments against Angular were like lack of information, but I'm sure that his arguments against Ember, people in the Ember community would be like, no, you can actually do this or that. The reason why I can tell you why I went with Angular. When I first picked up Angular, I tried out Knockout, JavaScript MVC, Ember, Backbone, and Angular, and a bunch of others. And the bottom line is Angular takes less lines of code. It just literally has less characters, less lines, it's shorter, and it doesn't use setters and getters for your data binding. And to me, that is so much easier to wrap my head around. Like you do scope.age equals 23 and scope.name equals John. And people can read that and understand that versus scope.set data, parentheses, age, comma, 23, that sort of thing. And Angular is really, really much easier for me to understand, except when you get into creating directives. It's a whole nother beast. And what Ember did have over Angular was the router, but UI router pretty much brought it up to speed. And I tell everybody, you should not be building a project without UI router. But to me, those are like some of the things. It takes less lines of code, takes less characters. It uses simple POJOs for putting data on and off the view. And yeah, I can just build stuff a little bit faster than Ember. I don't think anything really stands out to me as to why I would choose Ember over Angular. But if you know Ember better than Angular and you don't have a reason to switch, don't. Because the one detriment you're going to have is learning curve, and that's for any project or framework. Unless you have time to play around with it, practice, or you have an expert on your team who knows Angular. But yeah, if you're starting from scratch, I like Angular.
Okay, so they both get the job done. They just go about it. I guess I have used Angular, and it's straightforward. There's the conventions seem a lot more.
They're both ridiculously close to each other, and you're not picking up Backbone. Like if people were like, should I do Backbone or Ember? Go with Ember, because Backbone I think does it it has a different approach, and I feel that's the wrong approach. And I say go with Ember because Ember uses the inline binding, but which is the same thing as Angular. But if you're choosing between Ember and Angular, and same amount of knowledge of both, I like Angular better. But their templating layers, the creating directives can get a little tricky. You're going to have that sort of complication, though, with any framework. It's not specific to Angular.
Gotcha. All right, thanks. Appreciate it.
All right, any other final questions?
I have a quick question for you. So I am working with a client currently, and I'm trying to convince him to go the Angular route. Is there any maybe a quick video, or so he's not a coder, he doesn't know anything. So is there any way I can, wow him with Angular, and like a site I could send him to, or a video for him to watch that you would recommend?
So the way I've wowed people is literally writing a to-do list in pure HTML, no JavaScript. If you look at ng-class, ng-click, ng-if, ng-repeat, and I even used ng-init as a cheat, but I wrote a quick to-do app in pure HTML, and all the logic was in the HTML. It's not a good practice. If I was building a real app, I would have offloaded it more into the controller, but I would use the demonstration to show, I built the entire project, and I literally built a to-do list in pure HTML, putting all the logic into the HTML, and then I created a global function and used the as syntax, like controller as something. So I don't even have to inject scope, and I just do this dot add equals a function, and this dot items equals an array, and just showing how. And I did it right in front of people, and I did it in about 15 minutes, and I got all these features done. And if you use UI utils, there's event bindings for keyboard events. So like the return key, the space key, the backspace key, the escape key. And I could do all of that in the template. So even in HTML, I had keyboard bindings using no controller whatsoever.
Nice.
And that just sells people so fast.
I will try that. Thank you.
No problem. Okay.
All right, thank you. Any other final questions before we take off? All right, that's it, guys. Thank you very much. Once again, if you have any follow-up questions, then Dean will be available on Codementor, and hopefully we'll have another one like this soon in the coming weeks.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. And thank you so much, Dean. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, thanks. Take care, guys.